Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Brexit aside, two cabinet ministers have found themselves in hot water today. Amber Rudd has apologised after she referred to Labour's Diane Abbott as coloured in a phone-in on BBC Radio 2. We'll have more on that in a moment from Ben Wright in Westminster. But first, the case of the Northern Ireland Secretary Karen Bradley, who's also been saying sorry. Let's talk to Emma Vardy, who's in Belfast. Emma, what's she been apologising for?
Well, yesterday in the House of Commons, Karen Bradley said that killings by security services during the Troubles in Northern Ireland were not crimes, that they were by people carrying out their duty in a dignified way. Now, this is such a contentious issue in Northern Ireland, not least because there are a number of unresolved investigations at the moment looking at the deaths of unarmed civilians attributed to police and the British Army. And in fact, just next week, former British Army soldiers are due to find out whether they'll face prosecution for their involvement in Bloody Sunday, in which 14 civilians were killed. So she's faced a lot of criticism for this. Today, Karen Bradley has issued a sincere apology, saying she is profoundly sorry that her words were wrong, but it's not the first time she's slipped up, and she'll have work to do to regain the confidence of people in Northern Ireland.
Now over to Westminster and Ben. I gather Amber Rudd was actually trying to defend Diane Abbott.
She was, George, yes. Amber Rudd was saying that the online abuse suffered by black minority ethnic women was particularly nasty and had to stop. She was sticking up for Diane Abbott. But at one point during this interview, she described the Labour MP as a coloured woman.
It definitely is worse if you're a woman, and it's worst of all if you're a coloured woman. I know that Diane Abbott gets a huge amount of abuse, and I think that's something we need to continue to call out.
Now, that prompted a furious response from Diane Abbott, who said it was a revealing choice of words that was outdated and offensive. And it is pretty extraordinary that Amber Rudd used such an old-fashioned racial term that jars so badly today. It was inevitable she'd have to apologise. She did immediately, saying she was mortified by the clumsy language that she'd used. She's only been back in the cabinet 4 months, and a dispute about race and language is not where Amber Rudd wants to find herself.
All right, Emma, Ben, thank you both.
Now, hot on the heels of Chris Grayling's ministerial blunders a week ago, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Karen Bradley, has been forced to apologise over comments that she made about the Troubles. There have been calls for her to resign over her suggestion that deaths caused by the security services were not crimes. The comments come at a very sensitive time, as a decision is due next week on whether British troops involved in the Bloody Sunday massacre in Londonderry in 1972 will be prosecuted. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is there. Alex.
And indeed, Matt, what timing for these comments, and of all places, the House of Commons. You mentioned Chris Grayling, the Transport Secretary, failing Grayling, so-called in some quarters. Now tonight they're talking about Calamity Karen. This, the Secretary of State who professed not to have read the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement holding things together here insofar as they are being held together. And as she said, expressed surprise that people here vote along tribal sectarian lines. To say those comments raised eyebrows was one thing. These comments have sent the eyebrows out of the top of people's skulls, I would imagine, and that's what people are saying tonight. Continued calls for her to resign. And what people want, nationalist Republicans, justice campaigners, above all else they're saying, is a Secretary of State that they can rely on and trust to deliver what they want first and foremost in immediate terms, which is the Stormont Assembly, power sharing, back up and back running here in Northern Ireland. They're saying tonight they can't get that, they don't trust her, she has to go. A tumultuous 48 hours for the Secretary of State, but not, it seems, and this is how things roll at the moment, enough to send her out of the job.
I'm a little pingilly.
It all seemed such a low-level Commons exchange yesterday. A question from an MP, nothing to see here, no big deal, and then this.
Over 90% of the killings during the Troubles were at the hands of terrorists. Every single one of those was a crime. The fewer than 10% that were at the hands of the military and police were not crimes. They were people acting under orders and under instruction and fulfilling their duties in a dignified and appropriate way.
Just days from possible charges being brought against British soldiers for shooting 28 people on Bloody Sunday in Londonderry, 14 fatally. These comments seen by many as a mixture of ignorance of Northern Ireland politics from a Secretary of State and contempt for judicial process.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
Just hours later, Karen Bradley was back in the House, clearly forced into clarification.
The point I was seeking to convey was that the overwhelming majority of those who served carried out their duties with courage, professionalism and integrity, and within the law. I was not referring to any specific cases, but expressing a general view. Of course, where there is evidence of wrongdoing, it should always be investigated, whoever is responsible. These are, of course, matters for the police and prosecuting authorities who are independent of government.
Still not enough. Today, a full-scale apology was issued, no ifs, no buts. She wrote that she was profoundly sorry for the offence and hurt that my words have caused. Where people have lost their lives, we should all be equal under the law. Today, the Attorney General came to her aid.
I believe firmly that the Secretary of State will not have intended any offence, and she has in any event corrected the remarks.
In Derry itself today, calls for Karen Bradley to resign have continued.
I think the first word that comes to my mind is stupidity. I mean, it inflamed the situation sort of out of all proportion.
Should she go?
Oh, Karen Bradley should resign. She should have resigned the next day. I mean, she must have known that this issue, the Bloody Sunday issue, was coming to a head. For her to stand up in Parliament sort of just a few days before we hear whether there's going to be prosecutions, and to say it wasn't a crime. I mean, it sits very oddly sort of with the whole idea sort of not prejudicing
She
the
did
process.
retract, indeed, or possibly she was forced to retract, but retract she did.
Yeah.
Does that get her out of it?
Well, I don't think it does. I mean, I don't think you can retract something like that.
And all this from a Northern Ireland secretary who baffled people recently by admitting a few months ago she didn't understand that people in Northern Ireland voted largely along sectarian lines. That pattern of consistent blundering whilst staying in the job leaves some asking tonight if Karen Bradley is now entering the grayling sphere, apparent incompetence matched by unsackability.
Give another turn.
Only on Friday, Transport Secretary Chris Grayling's admission that more than £30 million in taxpayers' money would have to be paid to Eurotunnel after a lost legal case, again provoking calls for his resignation, all of them, once more, ignored.
Well, we actually have a very weak Prime Minister. We've got a Prime Minister who is fighting for every vote in terms of a Brexit deal, and that's the worry. We saw actually probably the Cabinet Minister who should have gone long ago in Mr Grayling, a man whose now list of failures is extraordinary.
So the question arising again tonight, that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, now so beleaguered by Brexit resignations that she can't let anybody go from the team, whatever the circumstances. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Derry.
Well, yes, it is Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, I said there. I'm joined now by Colm Eastwood, who is, of course, the leader of the SDLP here in Northern Ireland. Mr Eastwood, thanks for being with us. Now, you've spoken to Secretary of State today. I don't imagine you were talking about the weather.
No, we weren't talking about the weather. I told Karen Bradley that she needs to resign because it's absolutely clear now that she's way out of her depth. Karen Bradley hasn't exactly shown herself to know much about this place, but yesterday standing up and saying what she said in the House of Commons is just astonishing. Of course, it's insensitive to the many victims of violence and murder across Northern Ireland, but even more than that, we have people in this city next week being told whether or not their loved ones' murderers are going to be prosecuted by the prosecution service next week, and a British government minister stands up and says that these types of things aren't crimes.
Inconceivable that she just simply didn't misspeak in the House, as we all do from time to time, anywhere.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, but even at that, she shows herself to be way out of her depth. It is way beyond time now that Karen Bradley stepped aside and maybe spent some time reading an Irish history book, because she clearly does not understand the sensitivities of all of that here.
Did you get the sense, was she nobbled? She came out of the House and someone told her, officials said, you can't say that. That's beyond the pale. You've got to get back in there and put it right. Did she throw any light on that?
Well, I think somebody obviously put her right, but the statement she came out with yesterday, the so-called apology yesterday, wasn't an apology at all. Today, we obviously saw a more fulsome apology, but it's too little, too late. It's far too late. You cannot create that kind of damage either to victims or to due process and expect to just stay in your job. We have to, at some stage, realise that loyalty to Mrs May is not as important as loyalty to due process and to victims and survivors in Northern Ireland.
OK, point taken, but you've got to deal with someone. You've got to deal with some government somewhere, somehow. You don't have an assembly. You don't have power sharing. You're, frankly, you want to get rid of the one person who's still in position to bring that about. That's not going to help, is it?
Well, she hasn't exactly covered herself in glory in bringing that about. We've been asking for a talks process for over a year now. It still hasn't happened. Karen Bradley just doesn't seem to want to do it. I think that's because she's doing the bidding of the DUP, who of course have the British government over a barrel. And we know...
Or is it Brexit? The litany of resignations, and that is actually affecting the political process in effect here in Northern Ireland.
No, it absolutely is, but what we need most of all, because Brexit's coming, is a government in Northern Ireland to meet the challenges. And people need to hear very clearly what the Northern Ireland public think about Brexit, because it isn't represented by the DUP and it isn't represented by this British government.
Right, final quick question, because it is looming here in this city. A quick yes or no. Prosecutions, should they be being pursued over Bloody Sunday?
Absolutely. It doesn't matter whether you wore a uniform or not. You should not be allowed to murder people in the streets of Derry or anywhere else.
OK, Colin Eastwood, thanks very much indeed for being with us. And with that, from the Guildhall, or outside it here in Derry, Londonderry, back to you, Matt, in London.
Thanks, Alex. Well, earlier I spoke to Conservative MP Andrew Murison, who chairs the Northern Ireland Select Committee. So last year, Karen Bradley told the world that she was ignorant about Northern Ireland, and yesterday she actually proved it.
Well, I know Karen will be mortified by her misspeaking yesterday, and she's very quick to come back to the House of Commons and correct the mistake, and she's issued a fulsome apology today, which I have read. I think all of us who deal with Northern Ireland have to be very, very careful about what we say. A lot of the issues are extremely sensitive, particularly in relation to the past, and I know Karen will be deeply upset by what has happened, and I hope people will accept her fulsome apology.
You say she was quick to apologise, but she made the statement yesterday in the Commons. She then actually went back to the Commons and clarified the statement without issuing the apology, and then the apology came today, so it wasn't that quick.
Well, she certainly came back to the Commons very quickly to clarify what she had said.
But without an apology.
Well, I sat through that. The Prime Minister was alongside her, and the apology today, which has been published, is fulsome. And I think we should take her at her word.
Now, there are some people, including relatives of the victims of these massacres, who are saying that she should resign, she should quit. Should she quit?
Well, I think people are entitled to be upset, and some people will be more upset than others. And that's why Karen has apologised directly to them. I don't think she should quit. I think the affairs of Northern Ireland are at a very difficult point at the moment, and nothing would be served, and the people of Northern Ireland would not be served by further turbulence at this time.
Is this a case of yet another minister in the May government who has been saved by the very tight numbers on Brexit votes in Parliament? Chris Grayling, now Karen Bradley, under normal circumstances, both might have been forced to resign.
Well, ministers, particularly senior ones, are always under the spotlight, and there are always calls for ministers to resign. I think, you know, if ministers acceded to demands to resign that come through, we'd rarely have ministers in office for any length of time. And you journalists are very good at hounding them, if I may gently say so. The important thing is to continue delivering for people, and Karen is working extremely hard, as I know Chris is, to deliver within their briefs.
And how would you personally classify the killings carried out by British security forces? I mean, what would you say? What would your definition be?
Well, we've had the Savile inquiry. We've had a fulsome statement by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. I remember that statement extremely carefully. For all of us who have served in the armed forces, it was difficult, because most of us think we are the best, and we subscribe to extremely high standards. And when like all organisations, those standards are not met, we all feel it acutely. The important thing to remember is nobody within the armed forces are above the law, and neither do they consider themselves to be? They are there to uphold the law, and I think that's very important.
Andrew Muirston, thank you very much indeed.
Karen Bradley isn't the only member of Theresa May's government under pressure tonight. Our political correspondent Michael Crick joins us now from Westminster. Michael, what's been happening?
Well, two more senior cabinet ministers than Karen Bradley, both considered or mooted as possible leadership contenders, have got themselves into trouble today over remarks they've made on racial issues. First of all, Amber Rudd, the Work and Pensions Secretary, on BBC Radio this lunchtime, being interviewed by Jeremy Vine. Miss Rudd upset people by using the words coloured people. She was trying actually to sympathise with the Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott over the enormous level of racial abuse that Miss Abbott has received on social media. This is exactly what Miss Rudd said on the radio.
It definitely is worse if you're a woman, and it's worst of all if you're a coloured woman. I know that Diane Abbott gets a huge amount of abuse.
Now, Diane Abbott immediately said that the term coloured was outdated, offensive and a revealing choice of words. The minister quickly replied shortly afterwards and said she was sorry to Diane Abbott, and said that she was mortified at her clumsy language. Then, in the Commons chamber, the leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, upset people by suggesting that a proposal for a Commons debate on the definition of Islamophobia in Britain should be handled by the Foreign Office. This is what Mrs. Leadsom told MPs.
She raises a very important point about whether we should seek a definition of Islamophobia, and I would encourage her to perhaps seek an adjournment debate in the first instance so that she can discuss with Foreign Office ministers whether that would be a useful way forward.
Now, Labour's equality spokeswoman Naz Shah responded that to say that British Muslims facing Islamophobia here in the UK is a Foreign Office issue is truly baffling and horrifically alludes to British Muslims as foreigners.
Two cabinet ministers have been forced to make embarrassing public apologies after both made offensive comments. Work and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd said she was mortified after she called Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott coloured. And Northern Ireland Secretary Karen Bradley apologised for saying deaths caused by security forces during the Troubles were not crimes. From Westminster, here's our political correspondent Libby Vina.
An apology from one cabinet minister might be dismissed as unfortunate, but two in one day, well, not helpful when you're trying to appear competent. Their use of language or misuse was the problem. First, in a radio interview about online abuse, there was this from Amber Rudd.
It definitely is worse if you're a woman, and it's worst of all if you're a coloured woman. I know that Diane Abbott gets a huge amount of abuse.
It wasn't long before Diane Abbott responded, saying the term coloured is an outdated, offensive and revealing choice of words. Amber Rudd replied, mortified at my clumsy language and sorry to Diane Abbott. My point stands that no one should suffer abuse because of their race or gender. It came just hours after the Northern Ireland Secretary apologised for comments she made yesterday about victims of the Troubles.
Over 90% of the killings during the Troubles were at the hands of terrorists. Every single one of those was a crime. The fewer than 10% that were at the hands of the military and police were not crimes.
Today, she said, I want to apologise. I am profoundly sorry for the offence and hurt that my words have caused. The language was wrong, and even though this was not my intention, it was deeply insensitive to many of those who lost loved ones. Labour say an apology is not enough. She should now consider her position.
We need a Secretary of State who seems to be unbiased between the different political parties and can bring them back into storment. If she can't regain that credibility, then frankly, I'm not quite sure how she can continue.
A bad day only got worse when Andrea Leadsom gave this advice to a Labour MP who wanted to debate Islamophobia.
And I would encourage her to perhaps seek an adjournment debate in the first instance so that she can discuss with Foreign Office ministers whether that would be a useful way forward.
The Foreign Office, she later clarified that, saying Islamophobia in Britain was dealt with by the Home Office. Libby Vina, ITV News, Westminster.